A weirdly common problem in Final Fantasy XIV, possibly especially because of the age of the game combined with the amount of changes the game has got over the years, is that some players will claim that something is true without ever checking if it actually is. Either because they assumed it is the way they think, or because it was like that at some point. Welcome to Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, where I and my friends highlight the odd claims and misconceptions players make, and test them to see whether they are true or not, while also explaining how you can test it yourself so you can learn how to science stuff in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 1. If you stand perfectly in the center of a circular knockback mechanic, you don't get pushed at all. False? This is a kind of claim where the test relies on a lot of things to go just right, and even if we did get it just right, there's still the possibility that someone brings out their magnifying glass and measuring tape and goes, "Actually, I'm pretty sure you were a single pixel off." To that end, we have of course tried our best to test the claim from as many angles and adjustments as possible. And furthermore, instead of testing with a boss mechanic that can be unreliable, we have tested mainly with Blue Mage's Right Round spell, which is identical to a circular knockback mechanic. This of course offers the first possible error. What if Blue Mage's Right Round is coded differently than a boss mechanic circular knockback? My perspective on this is, why would it? To further add to this claim is typically accompanied by the claim that not only can it can be done consistently and reliably, which suggests that the pixel-perfect expectation would be at least unlikely. I will get back to this. With that, how will we go about testing this? Bring 2 Blue Mages. Alternatively, a ninja can replace one of them. Blue Mage 1 needs to have access to the spell Right Round number 106, acquired from Malika's Well. Blue Mage 2 needs to have access to the spell Loom number 7, which can be acquired from Flame Sergeant Dalvag in Northern Thanalan. Blue Mage 2 can be replaced with a ninja with access to Shukuchi. Make sure both Blue Mages are in combat with something, as Right Round can only push someone who is in combat and in your party. Have Blue Mage 2 use Loom to teleport exactly to Blue Mage 1's location. This is done with a macro like this, where the T part indicates that you want to teleport exactly to your target. Then have Blue Mage 1 use Right Round to push Blue Mage 2 away. For extra data, make sure to loom to Blue Mage 1 from different angles. What if the direction Right Round pushes you is related to this? Now, what we observed here is that with a really high consistency, Blue Mage 2 is always tossed in a specific direction. Incidentally, what direction that is seems to be somewhat unreliable. When we tested at my house, Gazel got tossed to the northwest. When we tested near Bent Branch, Gazel got tossed eastward instead. Now, this could be a case of Loom being 1 pixel off or something like that. However, we also checked whether we were exactly overlapped, and even after I micro-adjusted slightly backwards, Gazel still went straight eastward. We did a lot of attempts which consistently produced the same results. Now, why is that? Well, there are 2 things to consider here. The first one is that Final Fantasy XIV is not physics-based in this context, and the knockback that strikes you is essentially an action that 1. Does damage, and 2. Applies the effect of a specific length knockback in a direction. Now, the key here is that knockback will be applied anyway, so there's no way to avoid it. The second thing is of course to answer, okay, but what if I am standing exactly in the center? How does it decide a direction then? 3 options. Option 1. There is a default direction that it chooses if the actual result is unusable. Option 2. It chooses a direction randomly. Option 3. Game isn't designed to deal with this possibility and code simply reads the next byte over, which happens to be weirdly consistent and might vary depending on where you are. Now, let me explain why either of these options can be true despite the tests. For option 1, well, we had a lot of consistency, so this one is perfectly valid. For option 2, quote-unquote random boss mechanics in Final Fantasy XIV has this weird tendency to be consistent for a while. Like, if a mechanic randomly chooses 4 players out of 8, it seems to be likely to choose the same 4 10 times in a row. In fact, a friend of mine managed to never get chosen once when farming Suzaku back in Shadowbringers for a mechanic that chooses 4 DPS players, all of them normally, when there were 5 due to solo tanking it unsynced. This was out of 50 plus runs, done over multiple different sessions with different players. Final Fantasy XIV's randomness is weird, is what I'm saying. For option 3, this kind of stuff is rare and incredibly unlikely for such a game, but there's a way players find glitches in games, where you can sometimes control the way the glitch works, or what happens, based on making sure to control whatever that next byte over is when something goes wrong. Now, finally, how does a claim like this come about if it is actually not possible? The same way that Holmgang was assumed to still make you immune to knockbacks, after it stopped doing so. The knockback failed to connect for different reasons, you just didn't realize it. For instance, in this footage, I attempt to do this center knockback thing like half a dozen times, and only once does it work. Why? I will give you a couple of seconds to find the reason for yourself. Did you see it? Yes, I have in a release. I was immune. If I wasn't paying close attention, I could have easily convinced myself that it worked this time. Once again, I want to remind you that this claim is usually accompanied by, I can do it consistently. But if you can, then it can't possibly be this hard, right? Number 2. Some gear ignores syncing. False. Mostly. I'm guessing the origin of this claim is that some gear, for some reason, is better when synced down. It can be difficult to understand why that is if you don't understand how gear syncing actually works in the first place. An easy way to avoid the question is to simply say that the gear cheats the syncing system itself. But that is not how that works. Let's talk about how gear syncing actually works. When you enter a piece of content where your gear is synced down to a certain item level, 2 things happen. First, the actual item level of the gear piece is reduced to match the maximum allowed in the duty. Second, all materia on the item stops functioning completely. That is it, really. Now, the item level is actually the only thing outside of extremely specific exceptions that really limits how much of a stat a piece of equipment can have on it. So when this number is reduced, it automatically reduces how much you get out of all the other stats on the piece of equipment. Now, how can you figure out how much of a stat a piece of equipment is allowed to have at a specific item level? Well, if you find a high quality item that matches the maximum item level allowed in the duty, and then open the meld window for materia melding, you can actually see in the menu how many points of each stat it is allowed to have. That is actually the limit. In fact, it doesn't even have to be high quality, as the normal quality has the same limit, it just fills it less effectively. Now, you might already be thinking, but there's a bunch of stats here that aren't shown. Correct, you can't see, for example, how much strength is allowed, but the reason for that is that a high quality item would already have whatever is the maximum allowed for its appropriate item level. What this all means is that when you enter a duty with a maximum item level limit, gear that you are wearing that breaks this limit is reduced to match it, and any materia present on it will be turned off for the duty. Let's take an example. Let's say you try to enter the Twinning, which has an item level sync of 470. If I had a piece of 470 equipment, like an augmented Deep Shadow Cuirass of Fending for example, it would go in as is, and would have its 176 determination and 123 crit. I could even melt 2 materia in it to get more. But, as you probably know, 2 of the highest allowed crit materia wouldn't actually max out the crit stat anyway. If I instead came in as I am, with my augmented Credendum Cuirass of Fending, its crit and determination would simply be dropped down to 176, because that is the maximum allowed, and also the directed materia would stop working. This would be better than the Deep Shadow Cuirass with materia included. Alternatively, I could also use the augmented Deep Shadow Helmet, giving 111 crit and 78 tenacity, and use 2 materia. Again, the best ones usable on this gear gives plus 24, so that's 48. Or, if I come as I am with my Credendum one, the 129 crit and 184 tenacity will simply be reduced down to 111 for both, and the materia turns off. In this case, the augmented Deep Shadow helmet with materia would actually be better, because 111 tenacity is actually only 33 more, and 2 plus 24 materia would of course be 48. In all other aspects, these helmets would be identical. This kind of logic is also what gives rise to those kinda weird best in slot lists for ultimates, because getting effectively 2 stats maxed out on a piece of equipment is sometimes not better than having materia slots to supplement with. Now, I said there were some exceptions. The exceptions are that sometimes gear can break the barrier, and usually this is with relic weapons. That is to say, they can be allowed to have more than what is normally possible at a given item level. However, this property disappears if the relic weapon itself is synced down. That is to say, if I enter content where the relic weapon is of appropriate item level, it is possible that it may be allowed to have more of a stat than any item that gets synced down to it. This difference is, however, usually negligibly small. The second oddity is that a lot of content does not actually have an item level sync at all, but they might still have a level sync. This level sync of course syncs down your gear to match gear a character of such a level could have. However, if it is, say, max level content for a specific expansion, sometimes the range of item level can be difficult to determine. To give an example of this, I know that an item level 535 weapon is allowed to have 210 secondary stats on it. However, an item level 530 weapon is only allowed to have 207. Paladin is a level 80 duty with no item level sync. Despite this, my Endwalker relic weapon only gives me 207 crit, not 210. Because for some reason, the item level sync on the duty is 530. But legitimate level 80 gear is allowed to be any item level you can get your hands on. And that is really the only way that some gear can ignore the sync, because it is legitimately appropriate gear. Number 3. What happens if a blue mage uses Avail on a paladin and the paladin uses cover on the blue mage? Another follow-up to the many cover tests we've done in this series. Blue Mage has access to a spell that is the exact opposite of cover. Instead of redirecting damage from your target to you, you redirect damage from you to your target. To test this, simply find a mob a Blue Mage can safely tank, make sure to have Oath Gauge for cover on the Paladin, have the Blue Mage engage the mob, and then use Avail on the Paladin as the Paladin uses cover on the Blue Mage. The result of our test here is that both effects are allowed to exist. However, the Paladin, of course, only takes damage once for it, meaning Avail and cover don't stack, or something. A bonus follow-up question here is then, what if there's a middleman? And just like with a chain of covers, the game consistently resolves this kind of interaction by only allowing damage to be redirected once. So, we can assume all the interactions we've looked into for cover works the same for Avail, just in reverse. Number 4. If a mob hits someone covered by a paladin, but the paladin has arm's length up, does the slow get applied still? Simple test, all you need is a paladin, which can be yourself, and a chocobo. Engage an enemy, have the chocobo take aggro, use cover on the chocobo and use arm's length. We can see here in my test that the slow is applied. Interesting interaction. Number 5. Does cover redirect knockbacks too? For this one, find a fight with a knockback at all, and have someone get hit by a knockback while the paladin covers them. Another side to this is, does it matter whether the paladin is hit by the knockback too? So it is better if it is a knockback that you could possibly avoid naturally. For our test, we use the armadillo in Malika as well. If you bring 2 paladins, you will have enough covers to do something on every knockback. First, we have the covered player be the only one that is actually hit by the knockback, which results in the covering player getting tossed away and no one else. Then we have both players get hit. Still, only the covering player is tossed away, although it does look like they get knocked even harder. I am not 100% sure on this one. Still, the important part is that cover can redirect knockbacks too. Number 6. Do Chocobo Companions have a role? This is effectively only relevant for astrologians in the open world, as it would apply to the card buffs, assuming you would want to apply said card buffs to your chocobo. To be perfectly clear, there is no reason to give your Chocobo your cards, unless you for some reason happen to be severely undergeared or something, as you will typically do way more than double the DPS of your Chocobo, even if the Chocobo is in attacker stats. Still, it is interesting to know. To test this, first I have my Chocobo fight a mob with no buff to set a baseline. Then I do it again while supplementing with ranged cards. Then I do it again while supplementing with melee cards. In both cases, I do observe that the average damage is a bit higher, but also very similar. Then I do it again while using divination, which gives the same damage boost as a role-appropriate card would, and observe that in that time frame, the damage is slightly higher still. This suggests that the Chocobo does not have any role, as both card types fail to connect correctly. Once again, this information is mostly just interesting, as I strongly advise you to not give your Chocobo the cards. Better to use even a melee card on yourself. Have you made some weird or absurd claims or myths about Final Fantasy XIV that you'd love to see tested? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Stormblood's relic weapons from Eureka get their secondary stats from randomly rolling, which allows you to stack a lot more of a single stat than you normally would be capable of. Considering the explanation given in this video, it obviously would only work when it is not synced. Otherwise, it would be more beneficial to have a wider selection of stats on the weapon than it all stacked on one.